Okay, thanks. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. If you're in the East Coast of the United States, where I am, you're looking out your window and seeing a lot of snow. And so hopefully having a chance to kind of stay warm and listen to an interesting topic on conversation analysis in the language classroom will be of interest to you. My name is Catherine Box. I am a lecturer of educational linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. And I teach courses in TESOL methods and I teach TESOL practica courses as well. And my research that I do is really focused on using conversation analysis for practical reasons in the language classroom. So that can be ESL classrooms, EFL classrooms, or even modern language classrooms. I taught ESL and French for many years, and I also was a high school English teacher, both in the United States and abroad when I lived in France. So I bring a lot of practical experience, and one of the goals in my research is to make findings from research paradigms useful to teachers. So that's what I hope will be our focus today. Before I continue, I just wanted to remind everyone, I think everybody's on mute at this point, but if you are sure to keep your microphones on mute so that we don't hear feedback, that would be wonderful. And you're welcome to type in the chat box to communicate with me. This is my first webinar, so I'll be a little bit of a novice as far as handling interaction with you, ironically, since that's what I study. But I will do my best to keep the conversation going. And then, of course, we'll have time for question and answer at the end. So my objectives for this session are to, first of all, give a rationale for why you are tuning in today. Why would we use conversation analysis in the language classroom when it's a research paradigm that was not originally intended for teachers? And yet teachers have found it really useful. And we're going to talk about that to really motivate the reason for why you would be here today. Also, I'd like to go over just a few concepts that are related to conversation analysis and CA theory, two that I find particularly important for teachers. And I am assuming that people are coming without a foundational background in conversation analysis. So we'll really be talking about the foundational tenets that I think will be most useful to people, particularly if you haven't taken courses in CA before. And then my last objective, and probably my most important one, would be to explore ways to use CA in two different ways. One is to help you with designing activities in the classroom, using conversation analysis findings, and then also to help you manage how you interact with your learners in the classroom. So hopefully it's a pretty big agenda, but hopefully we'll be able to get to all three of them. So I want to begin with the question of, who needs conversation analysis, or CA as we call it, to begin with? As I had mentioned, it is not something that began with teaching in mind. So what brought me and many other people to CA as something guiding our teaching practice? And I'm going to give you my example from French, actually, because this is an activity I found in a French book, a very commonly used, actually really wonderful textbook that's in a current edition. And even if you do not speak French, which I imagine many people do not, you can probably link into some of the concerns I had when I was looking at particular tasks and activities in this textbook. So this conversation was supposed to be a text messaging between two people, Hassan and Abdel. And this textbook, Vis-a-Vis, really puts at the forefront the notion that they like to provide authentic communicative materials for students to really help them improve their communication in French. And they like to be on the cutting edge of new technology for communication. And they do many things very well. This is certainly not a critique of any particular textbook. But what I noticed about this text message exercise, and I'm going to use my mouse to show as well, is that even if you do not speak French, you can probably imagine that this is not really how people text. In French, certainly not in English, and probably not in many of the first languages that, that we all speak. First of all, they're using complete sentences. And second of all, if you start to kind of dig into it, you notice that the way the conversation is happening doesn't really sound how we would really talk to each other if we were texting each other. So the goal of this exercise, I imagine, was to focus probably on verb conjugation, perhaps also on vocabulary, but it wasn't really to improve the way we communicate in real time with other speakers of the target language, and in this case, French. And yet, this is a series that is really quite dedicated to the idea of helping students communicate better and providing authentic materials. So my feeling is that even today, with all that we know about communicative competence and helping our students learn to speak and become agile users of communication modes, we're still falling short of how we actually converse or by extension communicate using verbal, nonverbal resources and gaze and those sorts of things. We're still not really there yet as a field. And that's true not just for ESL and EFL, but also for modern languages. So some of the things that I'm getting some feedback here, so I just want to make sure everybody's on mute. Okay, that's good. So some of the things that I have noticed is that existing pedagogical materials are really not sufficient to improve our students' ability to interact in the target language. There's a reliance on artificially constructed dialogues, and I think many of us who use ESL or EFL textbooks can see this, that most of the dialogues that we see presented to our students are reconstructed, most often by the authors, based on native speaker intuitions, which research has proven to not really be very reliable. How we think we speak to each other is not necessarily how we're really speaking and interacting with one another. There's also a lack of accounting for all of what we call the contingencies of interactions. So many times when we're in a day-to-day communication with somebody, a lot of what comes up isn't going to fit the script that we've given our students in the textbooks, right? So if a student is learning how to complain, we often give them a constructed dialogue where the person who hears the complaint accepts that complaint. And that might not always happen, right? And so we're not really giving them all the different ways that a conversation can go when we give students many of the scripts that we're seeing in textbooks. Also, there's another kind of tangential issue, which is that in our own classrooms, when we're interacting with our students, or when our students are interacting with each other, we are often stymied by the way that classroom interactions work, so that we often, even with best intentions, have trouble giving our students time to creatively construct or play with language so that they are engaging in the kinds of communication patterns that they may expect to be engaged in outside of the classroom. So again, as I had mentioned earlier, I want to look not just at our materials, but also at the way that we interact with our students and see if there are ways that we can create spaces to mimic more of how, when we interact with them, that it will look more like how they would interact when they step outside of the classroom. So to answer the question, who needs CA? My quick answer is that we do. Because the good news, after telling you about all of these challenges that we face, is that how people interact has actually been studied by conversation analysis and can be taught both in the activities that we give our students and through the ways that we interact with our students in the language classroom. So that's why we're here today. So I'm going to begin the next part with a basic introduction to conversation analysis. And there are many books out there, and on the resource page or the reference page, I give you some textbooks that you can consult for a really hefty introduction to conversation analysis. But we're going to really focus on the important parts, and I'm going to begin with the story of how CA came into being, because it's actually quite an interesting story. So I begin in a typical story fashion. Once upon a time, CA was actually founded by 3 scholars, and not very long ago. It was really in the 1960s. Harvey Sachs, who is considered the intellectual muse of CA, and who unfortunately passed away in 1975 in a car accident. And so much of the work that he began was picked up by his friend and colleague, Emmanuel Schegloff, and also by Gail Jefferson, who was working with them as a research and graduate assistant at the time that conversation analysis came into being, about 60 years ago, 55 years ago or so. These 3 scholars really were not, they certainly were not language teachers, and they weren't even necessarily applied linguists. All 3 of them, I believe, had degrees in the social sciences. Harvey Sachs in particular seemed to be, he had a law degree. He was almost like a Renaissance type of person. He attended Noam Chomsky's lectures when he was at MIT. He was interested in Greek oracy. And so it seems like the 3 of them also lived at a time when graduate school was probably a lot less expensive than it is in the United States now, and you could sort of go and get a law degree and then go to graduate school and then hop out to California and do research there. So sometimes I get jealous when I read of their intellectual wanderings. But if you would like a really detailed account, I have on the bottom a good resource for you on the interdisciplinary roots of conversation analysis. I think that's why I might be so drawn to CA, because I have a background in literature, and many of us who studied English literature or other languages, some of the ways that we do the research of conversation very much mimics the way I would analyze a poem when I was an undergrad. And so I was really drawn to it because of my humanities background. I saw a lot of parallels there. So when the early work was aimed to actually uncover the machinery of mundane conversation, and I'm going to tell you the story of how Harvey Sachs came to realize that there was a machinery of, to mundane conversation. There was absolutely no intention to ever extend this into things like the language classroom that I know of, but you can probably already see that it would be a natural progression of things, because if indeed conversation has a systematic machinery to it, then perhaps it's something we can teach our learners. But at the time, that was not really the goal. They were American scholars working in English. Since then, of course, it has extended to many other languages. But at the time, the work was in English. And the major claim was that there was a universal organization to all talk. So for those of you that have worked with the transformational generative grammar of Noam Chomsky, he also says that there's a system to our grammar, right? That there are phrase structure rules, at least that was the original claim, that underlie our grammar. So the influence of Chomsky, there are some very small echoes that can be seen there. Chomsky wasn't at all interested in conversation as it is produced. However, this notion that there's a systematicity to our conversation certainly had echoes in linguistics at the time. So to continue on with this story, Harvey Sachs at one point followed his mentor, who was himself a sociologist named Harold Garfinkel, who was developing his own branch of sociology that we don't have time to get into today. But he followed him to become a research assistant professor at UCLA. And at some point, and it's not clear to me whether he worked at a suicide prevention center or whether he was studying audio tapes from calls at a suicide prevention center, but he had audio tapes in his possession of talk that was happening between people that were calling a suicide hotline and the people that were answering those calls. And he heard one exchange that struck him so much that when he was talking to his good friend Emmanuel Schegloff during walks, this exchange kept coming up. And later that year, and Schegloff tells the story way better than I ever could, he showed up at Schegloff's house in his living room with a manuscript in hand, and he wanted to really delve into what he was discovering. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the exchange. This was the 4-line exchange that Harvey Sachs claims really sparked the theoretical paradigm now that we know as CA. And this really speaks to his genius, because when I look at this, I didn't see anything until I start reading what Harvey Sachs and eventually Schegloff and others had to say about it. So it begins with somebody calling, and person A, we imagine, is the person who has answered this call on the suicide hotline. So Mr. Smith would be the person that's probably the counselor asking, may I help you? And the person who has made the call says, I can't hear you. The person answers, this is Mr. Smith, and person B says, okay, you're Mr. Smith. So in this, what seems like a pretty mundane exchange, Harvey Sachs really saw a gold mine. He believed that perhaps B actually could hear Mr. Smith, but was looking to keep himself anonymous and not having to introduce himself. And his argument went something like this. Person B knows that after person A identifies himself, the expectation in conversation would be that it's now my turn to identify myself. So if I fill this slot with something else, a claim to not be able to hear you, I can bypass having to identify myself and move the conversation along. And Sachs wondered, was this somehow designed on his part, B, whoever he was, on his part, not to identify himself, for whatever reason, we don't know. And if that is true, then the caller must know somewhere inside of him, and we were talking about 2 L1 speakers of English, that there would be an expectation in this particular slot right here to say who he was. And he must have somehow knew that. And by filling it with something else, he was able to design his turn so that he never had to make that move to identify himself. And Sachs found this fascinating and thought that if indeed his idea that B purposely was filling up this slot with something other than what was expected, that this means that all conversation, even something as simple as a telephone greeting, has an underlying organization to it. We do not talk off the top of our heads. It's not random. In fact, there is something that we all know drives the way conversation is supposed to work. And we are able to design our talk to best use that machine so that we can accomplish what we want to accomplish with our words. And as I said, I believe that, Harvey Sachs and Schegloff, when they recount this story, say it in much more detail. But the gist of it is this idea that there is a system to conversation, no matter how mundane this conversation is, that we are all attuned to in our L1. And so as language teachers, we can easily kind of make the leap to say that if this is true, if there is an underlying organization that we are all aware of as L1 speakers of a language, then there are a couple of things that we can do. Number one, we can show that system to language learners. And we can make that system explicit to language learners so that they learn something about how a particular language manages conversation. But number two, and this is a point that I've kind of arrived to after a bit of time, our students come with their L1s, whatever L1s they are, sometimes shared amongst themselves and sometimes not, where they will have a knowledge of how their L1 works. Again, it would be subconscious, but with some probing, we can get them to talk about how their system works, and then they can make comparisons between the language they're learning, in most of the cases for us, English, and how their L1 works. Because we all have an understanding, however tacit or subconscious, that the system of our conversation is organized in a particular way. So that to me is a really important point about the origins of CA that really make it how we can have it in our classroom to be useful to our students. So the method of collection for conversation analysis then is to transcribe real life conversations. At the time in the 60s, they actually recorded people's phone conversations. And of course, this was before cell phones and caller ID, so their machinery was just a little bit different in how people identify themselves. Nowadays, with video recording, of course, we are able to video conversations. So for instance, one of the things that I do is I video record classroom data, how are teachers interacting with students. But you can really record and transcribe anything at all, anything from people exchanging information on the street to the courtroom to medical interactions. But the key is to capture it as it's occurring in real time, not in a lab, not through a role play, but through as it's actually happening in real time, because the way we talk is not always the way we think we talk. And many of us who, you know, have arguments with people about communication, like I sometimes do with my family, I'll think I said something when in reality I really didn't say it, or maybe they really didn't hear it right. So I also have a natural affinity to this idea that real life data is really important. Some of the things then we look at as conversation analysts are, you know, how do people get in and out of conversations? And when you are in conversations, how do you know when it's your turn to talk, right? How do I design my turn so that it's related to what the person before me said? And how do I make it so that it will be understandable to the person who might speak after me? And then finally, the content of my talk. How do I introduce a story? How do I develop it? How do I change a topic? All of these things conversation analysts have studied and really tried to catalog. And as the field is growing, we're starting to look at other languages. We're starting to look at beyond the talk itself and into things like our gesture and our gaze and other parts. How do we use our bodies in space? But in the beginning, it really was talking about talk, which is why conversation analysis is sometimes referred to as talk in interaction, because it can be all different kinds of talk. It isn't necessarily a casual conversation. It could also be the talk in a jury room. It can be, as I said, a medical interaction, things like that. And for today, of course, we're going to look at it in terms of the language classroom. So what I would like to do is introduce to you two major tenets that are at what I think the foundation of CA. And I've given you 3 resources below. There are more that give you a much, much greater textbook size introduction to all of the different tenets. So this is really a very, very brief foray into all of the different things that CA has uncovered about talk. So we're going to start with what I consider the most foundational, which is the idea that talk tends to come in pairs that happen more or less one right after the other. We call this the adjacency pair. So according to conversation analysts, and most of the detailed work that happened after Sachs's passing was conducted by Schegloff, and Gail Jefferson was really responsible for the transcription of all of the talk. So all of the different things that you see happening in the transcripts I'm going to show you really was brought about by the transcription conventions of Gail Jefferson, who was originally working on this as well. So the adjacency pair says this: minimally, talk is characterized by certain features. There have to be at least 2 turns, by at least 2 speakers, often many more, but by at least 2. They have to occur more or less one after the other. Can get a little bit complicated. There can be interruptions, but at its most minimal function, it happens one after the other in an ordered fashion. And that word ordered is really important, because what is ordered in English might not be considered order in another language. What is ordered in American English might not be considered ordered in another variety of English. So that's a very relative word. But, and this is a big but, not any talk will do. And I'll show you what I mean by that on the next slide. Okay, so here is an example of two teenagers on the phone. This was collected by, I believe, Sachs and Schegloff in the 1960s. And here I'm going to point out some adjacency pairs to you. Okay, so right here, I'm going to call this greeting pair number 1. I realize that there's a line before that up here, but we're going to start with greeting pair number 1. What we have here is Hyla saying hi, and these two dots mean that the I has been elongated. So she says something like hi, and Nancy says something like hi, okay? And what conversation analysts would say is that this is an adjacency pair. You have a greeting, and you have a return greeting. The next thing would be what I'm calling an American pair, greeting pair number 2, and I learned this by having a French husband, because we tend to ask people, how are you? With an expectation that somebody would probably answer and then return that how are you, which my French husband finds very confusing, because he says, we really don't care how you are. That's just the second part of our greeting, right? That we tend to say, hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? Okay. So what CA would say is that these two things, these first highs and the how are yous, go together. Okay, and the reason why we know this is that if for some reason Nancy were not to answer this hi, so if Nancy picks up the phone and says hello, and Hyla says hi, and Nancy says nothing, Hyla would interpret that something's going wrong. Either Nancy can't hear me, Nancy's upset, Nancy doesn't want to talk to me. So what we discover is that when we say hi, there's a general expectation, whether we're aware of it or whether we are aware of it or not, that the person after that will return the greeting. If Hyla says hi and Nancy starts right in with, oh my gosh, Hyla, you never believe what happened to me today, without that return greeting, Hyla would also probably read something into that, like Nancy's really preoccupied with something because she didn't even bother to say hi back. Again, nothing that we're aware of necessarily when we have these conversations. It always goes so quickly. But if that return pair, that second pair part to this first part didn't happen, we would certainly notice it. Same thing with the second part of the greeting. How are you would often be answered with a return, how are you? There's also up here almost like a beginning to the greeting, which we call the summons answer. At the time when phone calls, when there wasn't caller ID, you would have a phone ringing and the person would pick up saying hello, not knowing who it is. Sometimes we bypass that now because we can see who's calling. And then after the greeting pair, there's another pair that I'm calling like the getting ready to talk about real stuff. Once you get done with your greetings, hi, how are you, fine, how are you? Okay, good. Now I think most of us who are proficient in the language would expect the real stuff to begin. Right, so this is the machinery of how we open up phone conversations in English. We tend to have an answer to the telephone, a greeting pair number 1, probably a how are you greeting pair number 2, and then something that will transition us into talking about other things. So that was a CA explanation of how telephone openings work. Here's another example when we're kind of mid-conversation. Anne says to Barry, why don't you come and see me sometime? The underlining, developed by Gail Jefferson, means that she put some emphasis on this word. The brackets here means that Barry started talking as Anne was finishing her turn. Here we have something like a question, why don't you come and see me? And something like an answer, I would like to. So another thing that we've noticed when we really delineate in great detail the talk of everyday conversations, questions tend to get responses. And really in the beginning, in many of these CA primers that you can look at, by Schegloff in 2007 and a more recent one by Rebecca Clift in 2016, will take you through different kinds of adjacency pairs. Because there are many different kinds. There are questions and answers. There might be something like request, granting a request, greeting, greeting. And you can really go through a language and kind of pick out what are the different pairs. And believe it or not, even long stretches of talk tend to occur more or less in these kinds of pairs. And as you can imagine, things can get more complicated as a conversation really becomes more content driven. So because we have these expectations of what comes before and what comes after a certain Tenet talk, if I give you a word like elephant, you are probably going to be able to tell me that what came before it was not something like hello, right? It's probably most likely something related to this term elephant. So by giving you a Tenet talk, you as a proficient user of English could do a pretty good job of predicting a series of things that could reasonably have come before this Tenet talk, right? In this case, it was, what is your favorite animal? So one of the things that we put forth as conversation analysts is that we're always talking in sequences, and these sequences are dependent on what comes before and will also help to determine what comes after. And it's so systematic that if I give you something in the middle, you can often tell me what will come before it, and maybe even predict with reasonable certainty what could have come after it, because talk tends to happen in sequences. Another one would be something like a request, right? If I say, do you have a pen? You would probably be able to tell me the possible second pair part that would go with that first pair part request. In this case, we have Orlando Bloom giving you a pen, right? My second pair part could be nonverbal, but there are many different ways. Yes, of course, here you go. No, sorry, I only have a pencil. But we are constrained in our second pair part by what that first pair part says. So what Schegloff, again, who was really the person to build out Harvey Sachs's ideas in great detail, is that we use resources in the language, including our bodies. Sometimes, in this case of Orlando Bloom, he just hands over the pen, the environment, and our talk is designed to accomplish something. We do things with our words, which has been brought up in other theoretical paradigms, such as speech act theory, but he really went into the details of the recognizable actions that we do with our words. So this is a real departure from the idea of abstract grammar rules or lists of vocabulary, and really into the notion that when I talk, I accomplish things. And when you talk to me, we are accomplishing things together through the construction of our adjacency pairs, which then expand out in all different kinds of ways that Clift and Schegloff in their textbook length introductions do a really great job of explaining. So that is the adjacency pair in a nutshell. The second tenet I would like to move to that I think is really important for language teachers is the notion of preference. Preference is the idea that our first pair part, so that first part of the adjacency pair, is often designed in a way that could be responded to in several ways. And we talked about the fact that, you know, we are usually constrained by what that first pair part is, right? So if I say hi, I'm not going to answer with elephant. I'm constrained by something like a return greeting. If I breach it, then somebody's going to think there's something wrong, some sort of trouble. So our first pair part can be responded to reasonably in several different ways. Some of the possible responses will work what I'm calling with the first pair part, or it's like a preferred response. Some will work against that first pair part, which would be a dispreferred response. So both preferred and dispreferred are reasonable responses. They're not absolutely outside of the norm. However, they, one, which would be the preferred, is what is the more expected answer, whereas the dispreferred would be something that would have some sort of resistance to it. And I think this will become more clear as I give you some examples. So for instance, as we've now said several times, a greeting would prefer a return greeting. A request would prefer a granting of a request. An invitation would prefer an acceptance. Okay, before I get to that next bit, I'm going to just go back then and look particularly at the last two, request and invitation. If I were to not grant you that request, that would be a reasonable response. However, it would be the dispreferred response because it is in some way resisting that request. So it's working kind of against it. And when you do something dispreferred, as you'll see in the examples I'm about to give, we work with the language a little bit differently. Same thing for an invitation. If I'm going to accept the invitation, that would be the preferred response to somebody saying, hey, would you like to go get a cup of coffee? If I'm going to reject that invitation, that would be a dispreferred response. And the way we handle our talk when we're performing a dispreferred is going to look a little bit different. Now, my caveat here, which comes up quite a bit, is that we're not talking about preference in terms of what we like or don't like, right? So maybe I'm giving you an invitation and I really don't want you to accept. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the interactional practice of inviting somebody in its conversational form will look for an acceptance. If I'm requesting something, I will look for you to grant that request in the way that I design my talk. Even if I'm lying, psychologically, my talk is still going to mimic as if I'm being sincere. So we want to be sure that when we're talking about something like preferred and dispreferred, we're not talking about internal emotions, but about what our talk looks like and how we design our utterance. Because whether or not you're being sincere doesn't usually affect how you design that talk. So to really elucidate what I mean here, preferred actions tend to be shorter, they tend to be straightforward in English, and they tend to come without much delay. Dispreferred actions will often come with some delay. Sometimes you'll like echo the question back to the person. Sometimes you'll say things like, oh, I'm really tired, or oh, I'm not very hungry right now. You'll do what we call qualification when you're doing dispreferred to kind of soften that rejection or resistance to the first pair part. You might give an account, so give a reason for why you're not granting that request. Oh, sorry, I don't have a pen right now. I only have a pencil. I'm giving a reason why I can't give you the pen. We also sometimes use things like dispreference markers, like well, all these kinds of delay tactics that my children are very good at doing when I ask them to clean up their room. Okay, so this, as I said before, would be preferred. I ask for a pen, and Orlando Bloom is kind enough to give me a pen right away. And I have to give a shout out to one of my presenters at Penn T-Cell East in Wat Park who had designed this slide that we presented in November. We all thought it was a really good example of preferred. Here's some examples of preferred that were collected over the years by conversation analysts. That's where you live, Florida. That's where I was born. Right? So here's your first pair part. Question, you get an answer that validates that question. How about friends? You got friends? I have friends, so-called friends. And I believe that was from the suicide hotline. Want to grab dinner? Sure, what are you thinking? Right? So a question, a request or an invitation, and an acceptance of that request. And all of these, which come from real-life examples, you can see that the person answers quickly with no hesitation or any markers of disfluency. All right, here are some examples of dispreferred. So here is Karen talking to Victor. She says, gee, I feel like a real nerd. You can all come up here. So she's inviting them to come up to her house, which I believe is like in the canyon in California. There's a 0.3 second pause. And whenever there's a pause, no matter how short, it often signifies something's going on. And often when somebody's about to give a dispreferred, that pause will pop up in your recordings. And in fact, Vic says, nah, that's all right. We'll stay down here. So instead of just saying no, you elongate it with some sort of account. We'll stay down here instead. And that's all right, which kind of qualifies it and sort of softens it. Here's a much more involved example of dispreferred. We begin with B asking J, would you do me a favor? Which we call that a pre-request. And if you look at some of the primers in conversation analysis, there are whole chapters devoted to what pre-requests look like. Would you do me a favor? Jay says, depends on the favor. That's what we call the second pair go-ahead. Setting up, which is another pre-request. Did your mom tell you that I called the other day? No, she didn't. Which is already, if he just says, no, she didn't, what's up? How can I help you? That would probably signal a better go-ahead, but the no, she didn't with an ending just like that already starts to set up that whatever is going to happen next is probably have some sort of trouble to it. So B takes 0.5 seconds, which in English is quite a long time. He says, well, I called. The guy says, uh-huh. There's another 0.5 seconds. And here comes the request. I was wondering if you'd let me borrow your gun. Now you've got 1.2 seconds. So any of us reading this transcript who are proficient speakers of English can probably tell that Jay does not want to give his gun, if he has one, to B. So 1.2 seconds is really long. Jay says, my gun. So he's echoing back, which is another delay tactic. B says, yeah. Then we get another 1 seconds, and then what gun? And then this actually will go on for quite a while. So what we can see here is that there is a no coming up, but many speakers of languages will not do a no straight out of the bat. And a lot of textbooks that I see will give you a script where if you're going to not grant something, it gives you one line to kind of slot in a no. But that's really not the way we talk. We often are going to pause, we're going to delay it, we're going to echo things back to people to really try to soften or hedge, because what we're doing is not preferred in the interaction. Okay, so we've talked about two really important tenets. We've talked about both adjacency pair and language in the classroom. What I want to then get to is, how can we make just these two findings useful to us in the classroom? And there are many, many others as well. So one of the things that CA has really hooked into is this notion that interactional competence is an important part of learning how to speak a language. This is built off of communicative competence, which is a well-known model of how somebody comes to use a language in a communicative fashion. Interactional competence goes even further and says that our speakers, our learners, need to possess the capability to manipulate verbal and nonverbal resources so that they can successfully interact with others. It's a small statement, but it means a lot. One of the things that means is that we need to take into account both the speaker and the listener, which communicative competence does not do. Communicative competence, which many of you probably are familiar with in communicative language teaching, looks at the model of language use with only the speaker in mind. Interactional competence says we need to send our users out able to interact and respond to all the different contingencies of interaction out in the world. And what that means is we have to teach them how to enter into a conversation, exit a conversation, recognize when a topic is changing, and these real details of conversation that so far many of our textbooks haven't really tapped into. So there are two different ways, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we can do this. We can infuse classroom activities with elements informed by CA insights, right? And what Waring calls the what of language teaching, the actual content of our language teaching. But we can also work with what Waring calls the how of language teaching, which is using CA findings to manage our own classrooms to improve teacher-student and student-student interaction. So one of the things that I recommend, because most textbooks have not really used CA findings, if you look at my resource slide, there are two textbooks that have tried to incorporate CA findings, and I give you links to accessing them at the end of the slide. But one of them is to adapt existing textbook activities, right? So what we see here is taken from a very common, very well-known ESL textbook series called Step Forward. And this is how they were teaching students to do introduction. And if you just take a second to take a look at it, you might notice that from what we've learned about greetings in the beginning here of adjacency pairs, this is not really how a greeting would look when you're introducing somebody, right? So Rita, first of all, doesn't return the greeting before she just asks your name again, and then actually puts forth a candidate's spelling, which many of us as proficient users would not necessarily see as a preferred way to respond to introducing somebody that you haven't met yet. Also here, you have your hi, I'm Rita, and this is Alma. And again, we usually have some sort of return token hi before we get to the nice to meet you. So one of the things that we would do, and if we were in a face-to-face workshop we could work on together, would be to revise this dialogue. And we can do it one of two ways. We can revise it for our students, or we can have our students, if they're perhaps more advanced, revise it themselves to have it mimic more of how they think talk happens in interaction in the target language. You can also ask students to compare and contrast, especially if you're in EFL where you all share another language, to compare and contrast with how introductions would work in that other language. There's another one here. Would you like to get together this Saturday? So this is an invitation. Sure, what would you like to do? Which is an acceptance of that invitation. Well, on Saturday night, there's a soccer match at the stadium or there's a free concert in the park. Take your pick. I think I'd rather go to the concert. Should I pick you up at 7 o'clock? Let's play it by ear. I'll call you on Friday night. So there's a lot here that we could unpack, but one of the things that we really hooked into when we were looking at this, a couple of CA people and I, were, should I pick you up at 7 o'clock? Clearly, A has another idea in mind, but there are no hesitation markers or any delay or signs of disfluency built in here, which is what CA Findings has told us we would see if we're going to reject that offer of being picked up at 7 o'clock. So again, this is something that with a CAI, you can go back to some textbooks activities and try to put in some elements that we've learned are part of authentic interactions, or you can make it a discussion of the classroom yourself. And this again is from Step Forward, which, as I had said in the beginning when talking about the French textbook, these are wonderful textbooks for many reasons, but there still is, I believe, a chasm between how they present interaction and how we actually talk. Okay, here's another strategy, and this comes from a book that was actually explicitly ways that you can make conversation analysis, ways that you can bring conversation analysis into your language classrooms. You can actually raise awareness about how adjacency pairs work, and you'll have this slide to look through in more detail when you review the presentation. But what you do, and I adapted this just a little bit from Wong and Waring, you can give second pair parts to students on index cards, and then you as the teacher read out the first pair part and have the person who thinks they have the second pair part stand up or say the second pair part so that they can see how adjacency pairs work. And this is one that I really liked that they came up with, because you can adjust the difficulty of it. You could have it be really basic greetings for a beginner class. You can extend it for when you move into more intermediate or even advanced classes by perhaps having more than one person have a part that would work and discuss why 2 or 3 different second pair parts would work with the first. You could compare and contrast somebody who's giving a preferred second pair part to somebody who's giving a dispreferred. So there's a lot of different ways that you could work this to raise students' consciousness of how adjacency pairs work in the language. And you do not necessarily have to use the CA terminology of adjacency pair. You can simply call it, you know, sort of how talk unfolds in the classroom, depending on the level of your students and where you think their interest is. So this one is really worth a more careful look through, and I highly recommend this textbook as well. I've also found, and again, I have a link to this one in our resource page, there are a few textbooks that have actually tried to introduce adjacency pairs to language learners in a really user-friendly way. And here you can see, if you look through it, that they give you some vocabulary that would be colloquial vocabulary that we would use in everyday conversation. They talk about discourse markers. They have some delay tactics. All of these things were actually built in to this task in the textbook. And you can extend these kinds of interactions to include digging into vocabulary. You can dig into what verb tenses are used. So it doesn't have to be something separate from a grammar or vocabulary exercise. You could, with preparation and design, really integrate it all so that you're infusing it into a grammar or vocabulary exercise, talking about, for instance, how want to becomes wanna, right? In the context of adjacency pairs. I also would talk a little bit about the how strategies. And I chose one today because I know that we only had an hour to talk together. But one of the how strategies that I think is really important, which is learning to work with learner contributions in your classroom. And there have been a lot of CA people that have done research on how people manage learner contributions in the classroom. And if you look at Waring's 2019 article on specifying the what and how, some of the people who have worked on topics of really maximizing learner contributions. So one of the things that we've discovered in Classroom Talk is that the way Classroom Talk is sequenced often restricts students to answering questions. So they're usually restricted to that kind of second part of an adjacency pair. Teacher asks a question, student answers the question, teacher will tell the student whether or not he is right or wrong. That's a very canonical three-part sequence called the initiation, response, feedback sequence that some of you may have learned about because it goes beyond conversation analysis and is part of many of our language learning training. And here's an example of it, a very well-known example. Teacher asks what time it is, Denise. Denise answers 2:30. Teacher says very good. So Denise, as a language learner, only gets to produce one word, which is the second pair part to this question. What we would like to do as conversation analysts is to try to figure out ways to get students to talk more. And it's not just a matter of putting students in groups and letting them talk on their own, but also ways that we can manage our own interactions with students so that we can maybe elongate the second turn, maybe spark more people to contribute after we've given feedback. So Waring has said in 2008 that maybe instead of saying things like very good, which tends to kind of end the sequence, maybe we could ask probing questions, ask for explanations, elicit other students to open up the slot here after the third part for other people to talk, or perhaps for Denise to talk more. Another way you could do it is you ask a genuine question in that first pair part, like ask Denise to describe her family, right? That's going to open up that second pair part for Denise to produce a much longer stretch of talk. So this is where you can bring in students' lives, maybe expertise on a subject that you don't know anything about, like maybe you're reading an article on the environment and you have somebody in your EFL class who has a degree in environmental science. That person could really open up that second pair part to a much longer turn at talk where he's able to manipulate and use the language to creatively construct. You can elicit other responses that can help that person co-construct and really open up these teacher-student interactional moments so that the students have more opportunities to talk. And then also there are ways to allow students to take that first slot, right? So having the students ask each other questions so that you have an entirely student-generated dialogue, or to ask the teacher questions. That would not only open up the first slot, the teacher then answers, and then the students could build out the feedback to the teacher. So these are really quick presentation of ways that this can happen, but there has certainly been literature that has given examples of how this might work and how successful it can be in the classroom. Also give feedback to students that, that leads them to use resources available to them in the classroom for further contribution. So maybe in this third slot, you can point out to Denise that there is a line of clocks in different time zones in the front of the room, and she could maybe use that to expand upon answering the question of what time it is, to say what time it is in other parts of the world as well. You might point out to them in the feedback slot that there's, you know, there's a piece of butcher paper that students have written on, and we've done a gallery walk on it. So can you tell me more based on what you see here on the wall? To really give students an opportunity to say more about what they know and to use the language in better ways. Okay, so having gone through our goals for the session, where do we go now? I believe that one of the things that us as CA people need to do is to really help develop curriculum that enhances our teaching of speaking based on our findings. Until we're able to do that, though, I do believe that there are things that teachers can do to either adapt or get their hands on authentic materials so they can show to their students how talk actually works. Also, really looking at ways that we can develop interactional competence in the language classroom. Teaching our students about gestures, about facial expressions, about the what pausing does in conversations, and making this a central part of our language classroom, integrated with vocabulary and grammar and all of the other parts of our projects as language teachers. And then, as I said, attending to the moment-by-moment talk in our own classrooms, creating space for contributions, not just at the lesson level where you say, okay, I'm going to put students in groups and give them a chance to talk, but also at the actual interactional, oops, I don't know what that is, also at the interactional level where teacher-student contributions are able to be maximized so that learners can use what they know and find more time to allow them to construct with the language. Thank you very much. That was a lot of talking on my end. I would love to hear any feedback or questions that you have from the group. Thank you so much for listening to me talk that long. So I do believe that you have in your chat, if you would like to ask any questions in your chat, I can then revoice so that other people can see it and answer the questions. Oh, you're welcome, Hadia. Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks to everybody who came. And hopefully anybody who's listening to this recording after the fact. I saw some familiar names pop up on the screen. So thank you for your support. And to all the unfamiliar names, I really appreciated you coming. Thank you, Anna. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to email me as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Yes, I agree, Hadia. CA would be really helpful. And I think learning, as we're getting into texting, and we're seeing a lot of interactional norms start to be put in place with texting, I think that would be one area where we could really teach our students a lot about how people, you know, how people are using emojis. I think that's really a field ripe for CA investigation, and teaching our students how to use that, because as our world is becoming more globalized, their interactions with other speakers of a target language will often include online environments and social media. Okay, well, again, if there's no other questions, feel free to email me if you'd like anything to be further explicated. Hopefully, you'll find the resources and the reference pages useful as well for further information. Thank you. Great. And sorry about whatever that notification that's coming up. Some sort of spam popped up on my feed. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I will leave the chat room, and it was really nice talking to everybody. Bye-bye.